Hello. So today I'm going to try and talk about Robert Pirsig and his famous book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and how to decode reality. This is all stuff that's just kind of in my head, and I've written a couple essays about it, but I'm not an academic and I've never lectured, so this is going to be a little shoot from the hip in my parents' home. And because I'm a failed writer, but I feel like I know a lot about this, so this might take a while, might be a little meandering, but we might get somewhere. So my name is Jonah, and this is a very complex topic. It's complex because each of us, like the way one learns how to understand reality, how to decode reality is, so yesterday I was talking to my schizophrenic friend, and he said this thing to me. He said, we were talking about the news, and he said, half the time I don't believe any of it, right? And so obviously schizophrenia is on a continuum of how we understand reality. Schizophrenia is like this far end of the continuum. And then, I don't even know what the other end is. The other end is pure rationality, I guess. But, I mean, it's kind of complicated with him because in another way, like, him not believing any of it is actually him believing all of it. Like, it's like, that phrase, well, if it's everything, it's nothing, and if it's nothing, it's everything. So it's like being really paranoid also makes you really deeply trusting on another level. Anyway. That's neither here nor there. Like I said, this is going to ramble a little bit. Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is possibly the most misunderstood 20th century book. I mean, his follow-up book, Lila, is more misunderstood. I mean, because it got read a lot less. And Zen had the Pilgrim's Progress effect put on top of it. Like, how if you've been in many people's homes, people who read and stuff, you'll often see a copy of Zen on their bookshelves, and I guarantee you, 90% of the people who own it have never read it, or if they have read it, they've scratched the surface. They understand that there's a motorcycle involved, that the word Zen is in the title. Which was him capitalizing off of the zeitgeist of the time, but in a way that made him money and allowed him to be free to write his follow-up, which is great. But it also has never really, I think, got the academic attention that it deserves. Yeah. And, well, I mean, I don't really know that about academia. I mean, we could go into why or why not that might be. I mean, Robert Pirsig sort of has a notorious dislike of the academic mindset. In Lila, he calls most philosophers philosophologists, basically, because they don't actually do the work of philosophy. They do the work of examining philosophy, which he argues is not the same thing, right? I mean, can you follow that logic? Anyway, so the Pilgrim's Progress effect, which I was talking about, is like everyone seemed to need a copy of it. It was sort of like it got so popular that it was like almost required to be in some people's homes, but there was no requirement to actually read it. And I think the same goes for Zen. To truly understand it, it is a weird book. It is 56 pages into this book. You are prompted with a problem that is the most bizarre and obtuse problem. Like, when I get around to reading it here for you, you'll be like, you won't even really be able to clickety clack with it. It's a really long term problem. Oh wait, I called it a problem. It's actually a solution to a problem. So he begins with a solution to a problem, but the problem of reality is very well, to say it's very complex is an understatement. But to begin with, I want to start by just reading all of chapter 10 from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, because I think it's the foundational chapter. If you want to look it up at home and and go along with it, like I think chapter 10 contains the whole problem, right? This problem that Pirsig struggles with reality, sanity for one. His character Phaedrus has a mental breakdown that's discussed in the book, and it's later discussed further in Lila. I'm going to try and avoid talking too much about Lila, even though I think it's the better Pirsig book because it like expands on his moral philosophy and like lines out our thinking of it. But first of all, we're going to talk about sanity and decoding reality, and specifically that there are so many different ways a person can attempt to bring a real consciousness into their life, like bring reality as the foundational experience of their life. And he begins with a quote from Einstein. I know that overused hack, but it really sets forward a differentiation in how one can try to come to grips with understanding reality. Like what is the intentionality behind someone's pursuit of reality? We are also at a kind of beginning point in the things I'm discussing, at which one can at last start to talk about Phaedrus's break from the mainstream of rational thought in pursuit of the ghost of rationality itself. There was a passage he had read and repeated to himself so many times it survives intact. It begins, "In the temple of science are many mansions, and various indeed are they that dwell therein, and the motives that have led them there. Many take to science out of a joyful sense of superior intellectual power. Science is their own special sport, to which they look for vivid experience and the satisfaction of ambition. Many others are to be found in the temple who have offered the products of their brains on this altar for purely utilitarian purposes. Were an angel of the Lord to come and drive all the people belonging to these two categories out of the temple, it would be noticeably emptier, but there would still be some men of both present and past times left inside. If the types we have just expelled were the only types there were, the temple would never have existed any more than one can have a wood consisting of nothing but creepers. Those who have found favor with the angel are somewhat odd, uncommunicative, solitary fellows, really less like each other than the hosts of the rejected. What has brought them to the temple, no single answer will cover. Escape from everyday life, with its painful crudity and hopeless dreariness, from the fetters of one's own shifting desires. A finely tempered nature longs to escape from his noisy, cramped surroundings into the silence of the high mountains, where the eye ranges freely through the pure, still air and fondly traces out the restful contours apparently built for eternity." That passage is from a 1918 speech by a young German scientist named Albert Einstein. Phaedrus had finished his first year of university science at the age of 15. His field was already biochemistry, and he intended to specialize at the interface between organic and inorganic worlds, known as molecular biology. So Phaedrus is Pirsig. The Zen is it's kind of a beautiful free flow state of something he's been thinking about for 30 years. He's kind of to talk about Pirsig is to talk about someone who had a close relationship with what we might call genius. He was in he started his college career at 16, dropped out, did other things, was card dealer in Reno, and so this is something he's been thinking about for a long time, and he only wrote 2 books. Zen was a hit. Lila was his follow-up masterpiece. I'm going to continue. He didn't think of molecular biology as a career for his own personal advancement. He was very young, and it was a kind of noble, idealistic goal. Okay. The state of mind which enables a man to do work of this kind is akin to that of the religious worshiper or lover. The daily effort comes from no deliberate intention or program, but straight from the heart. If Phaedrus had entered science for ambitious or utilitarian purposes, it might never have occurred to him to ask questions about the nature of a scientific hypothesis as an entity in itself. But he did ask them, and was unsatisfied with the answers. The formation of hypotheses is the most mysterious of all the categories of scientific method. Where they come from, no one knows. A person is sitting somewhere, minding his own business, and suddenly flash, he understands something he didn't understand before. Until it's tested, the hypothesis isn't true. For the tests aren't its source is somewhere else. Einstein had said, "Man tries to make for himself in the fashion that suits him best a simplified and intelligible picture of the world. He then tries to some extent to substitute this cosmos for the world of experience and thus to overcome it. He makes this cosmos and its construction the pivot of his emotional life in order to find in this way the peace and serenity which he cannot find in the narrow whirlpool of personal experience. The supreme task is to arrive at those universal elementary laws from which the cosmos can be built up by pure deduction. There is no logical path to these laws, only intuition, resting on sympathetic understanding of experience, can reach them." And Pirsig scratching his head. Intuition? Sympathy? Strange words for the origin of scientific knowledge. A lesser scientist than Einstein might have said, "But scientific knowledge comes from nature. Nature provides the hypotheses." But Einstein understood that nature does not. Nature provides only experimental data. A lesser mind might then have said, "Well, then man provides the hypotheses." But Einstein denied this too. Nobody, he said, who has really gone into the matter will deny that in practice the world of phenomena uniquely determines the theoretical system, in spite of the fact that there is no theoretical bridge between phenomena and their theoretical principles. Phaedrus' break, his break from sanity, resulted then as a result of experience. He became interested in hypotheses as entities in themselves. He had noticed again and again in his lab work that what might seem to be the hardest part of scientific work, thinking up the hypotheses, was invariably the easiest. The act of formally writing everything down precisely and clearly seemed to suggest them. As he was testing hypothesis number 1 by experimental method, a flood of other hypotheses would come to mind, and as he was testing these, some more came to mind, and as he was testing these, still more came to mind, until it became painfully evident that as he continued testing these hypotheses and eliminating them or confirming them, their number did not decrease. It actually increased as he went along. So you may be a little skeptical of Pirsig's ability to sort of infinitely create hypotheses. I know I was, but this is where we have to come into contact with the idea of genius, or at least indulge a little in the relaxation of skepticism and trust in his own hypothesis that hypotheses themselves. Well, I mean, I don't know you as an individual. This is obviously I'm not talking in front of a class here, but at 23, I think I could maybe have, if I was of a certain mind, have sat down and thought of a continuing series of hypotheses. In fact, I think I did. I was just continually proved they were all wrong until it became invariably more difficult for me to convince myself that coming up with another hypothesis was a worthwhile endeavor, which I think is part of what Phaedrus or Pirsig is dealing with here. At first, he found it amusing. He coined a law intended to have the humor of a Parkinson's law that the number of rational hypotheses that can explain any given phenomenon is infinite. It pleased him never to run out of hypotheses. Even when his experimental work seemed dead-end in every conceivable way, he knew that if he just sat down and muddled about it long enough, sure enough, another hypothesis would come along. And it always did. It was only months after he had coined the law that he began to have some doubts about the humor or benefits of it. If true, That law is not a minor flaw in scientific reasoning. The law is completely nihilistic. It is a catastrophic logical disproof of the general validity of all scientific method. If the purpose of scientific method is to select from among a multitude of hypotheses, and if the number of hypotheses grows faster than experimental method can handle, then it is clear that all hypotheses can never be tested. If all hypotheses cannot be tested, then the results of any experiment are inconclusive, and the entire scientific method falls short of its goal of establishing proven knowledge. About this, Einstein had said, "Evolution has shown that at any given moment, out of all conceivable constructions, a single one has always proved itself absolutely superior to the rest," and let it go at that. But to Phaedrus, that was an incredibly weak answer. The phrase, "at any given moment," really shook him. Did Einstein really mean to state that truth was a function of time? To state that would annihilate the most basic presumption of all science. But there it was. The whole history of science, a clear story of continuously new and changing explanations of old facts. The time spans of permanence seemed completely random. He could see no order in them. Some scientific truths seemed to last for centuries, others for less than a year. Scientific truth was not dogma, good for eternity, but a temporal quantitative entity that could be studied like anything else. He studied scientific truths, then became upset even more by the apparent cause of their temporal condition. It looked as though the time spans of scientific truths are an inverse function of the intensity of the scientific effort. Thus, the scientific truths of the 20th century seem to have a much shorter lifespan than those of the last century, because scientific activity is now much greater. If in the next century, scientific activity increases tenfold, then the life expectancy of any scientific truth can be expected to drop to perhaps 1/10 as long as now. What shortens the lifespan of the existing truth is the volume of hypotheses offered to replace it. The more the hypotheses, the shorter the time span of the truth. And what seems to be causing the number of hypotheses to grow in recent decades seems to be nothing other than the scientific method itself. The more you look, the more you see. Instead of selecting one truth from a multitude, you are increasing the multitude. What this means logically is that as you try to move toward unchanging truth through the application of scientific method, you actually do not move toward it at all. You move away from it. It is your application of scientific method that is causing it to change. Now, I think it's also important to note here, we're talking 1970s scientific experience, which isn't well, I'm just going to talk about my own personal relationship in that I think we are not actually increasing tenfold in the way that he predicts in this next century. I don't think it's anywhere near that. I think, if anything, we've probably slowed to a crawl. And arguably, I think that is because something Pirsig points out in Lila about how the intellect has the highest moral quality, but the social implications need to rein in the intellect. And I believe that the intellect has been reined in by social implications. But that is a far longer topic, and maybe for a completely different video entirely if I ever get to that. We'll see if I have enough voice to keep through this chapter. What Phaedrus observed on a personal level was a phenomenon profoundly characteristic of the history of science, which has been swept under the carpet for years. The predicted results of scientific inquiry and the actual results of scientific inquiry are diametrically opposed here, and no one seems to pay too much attention to the fact. The purpose of scientific method is to select a single truth from among many hypothetical truths. That, more than anything else, is what science is all about. But historically, science has done exactly the opposite. Through multiplication upon multiplication of facts, information, theories, and hypotheses, it is science itself that is leading mankind from single absolute truths to multiple indeterminate relative ones. And so here's where we bump up into this term of like where he's starting to lose his mind a little bit, right? So we're beginning to see the substructure of what makes reality so hard to decode for so many people. You have all these different individual truths, and we're not even going to talk about the efficacy of those truths, insofar as it's the difficulty of actually decoding them, and like my friend with schizophrenia, like what you can trust, what percentage of the time, and even if there is any trust at all, Pirsig is pointing out, if we begin to trust the scientific method, we realize the more we trust in the scientific method, the actual further from the truth we are placing ourselves, because the more theories we get for the truth, the less we're actually at a truth. Okay, I think that was obvious in the text, but I'm just reiterating that. It's possible now to look back a little and see why it's important to talk about this person. Okay, what Phaedrus saw in the isolation of his own laboratory work years ago is seen now everywhere in that technological world today. Scientifically produced anti-science chaos. It is possible now to look back a little and see why it's important to talk about this person, Phaedrus, in relation to everything that's been said before concerning the division between classical and romantic realities and the irreconcilability of the two. Unlike the multitude of romantics who are disturbed about the chaotic changes science and technology force upon the human spirit, Phaedrus, with his scientifically trained classic mind, was able to do more than just wring his hands in dismay, or run away or condemn the whole situation broadside without offering any solutions. As I've said, he did in the end offer a number of solutions, but the problem was so deep and so formidable and complex that no one really understood the gravity of what he was resolving, and so failed to understand or misunderstand what he said. That's Zen. This book is completely misunderstood. He's even laying it out in chapter 10 that if you're trying to make an understanding of this, it's a lot harder work than you think it is. It's not it became a pop book, but it's not poppy. There's really some heavy duty thinking you kind of have to do here. The cause of our current social crisis, he would have said, is a genetic defect within the nature of reason itself. And until this genetic defect is cleared, the crisis will continue. Our current modes of rationality, I don't know about the word crisis. I think that's a little, I would go for the word difficulty, I think. Our current modes of rationality are not moving society forward into a better world. They are taking it further and further from that better world. Since the Renaissance, these modes have worked. As long as the need for food, clothing, and shelter is dominant, they will continue to work. But now that for huge masses of people these needs no longer overwhelm everything else, the whole structure of reason, handed down to us from ancient times, is no longer adequate. Now, I think this is also part of youth, right? This is finding the faults and despairing. This is him, I think, explaining why he went crazy. I don't know if we necessarily need to be this pessimistic looking upon it, since there are answers given. There are ways of being comfortable with the fact that certain people are going to decode reality at their own pace, and coming to it in one's own time is, it's through teachers, it's through works. But anyway, let's keep going. I have a vision of an angry, continuing social crisis that no one really understands the depth of, let alone has solutions to. And then he talks about his friends, who he's been talking about in the book, who don't really, who have this relationship to technology that seems kind of anti-technology. And the art of motorcycle maintenance side of this book is being okay with, I remember the first time I read it, I don't think I ever even understood it, but it was, the first thing that stuck in my mind was he takes the bike to a repair shop, and the guy does a really simple fine weld on his gas tank that he needs done, and he's amazed at the guy's weld, and he's like, "How much do I owe you for this?" And the guy's like, $1, because he's so good that it's not even like, I don't even know what the point of that is, really. It's just marveling at something people overlook that seems simple, but you're still re-examining it. I don't know. We'll come back to that. No one that Phaedrus talked to seemed really concerned about this phenomenon that so baffled him. They seemed to say, we know scientific method is valid, so why ask about it? Phaedrus didn't understand this attitude, didn't know what to do about it, and because he wasn't a student of science for personal or utilitarian reasons, going all the way back to Einstein's quote, it just stopped him completely. It was as if he were contemplating that serene mountain landscape Einstein had described, and suddenly between the mountains had appeared a fissure, a gap of pure nothing. And slowly and agonizingly, to explain this gap, he had to admit that the mountains, which had seemed built for eternity, might possibly be something else, perhaps figments of his own imagination. Okay? So, I think everyone, if they're attempting to engage with the intellect, is going to reach this moment to some degree or another. Unless you're doing it for utilitarian reasons, which, by the way, I don't think me or Pirsig is judging, right? We're saying in the temple of science, you guys are there, right? I mean, Einstein does say if it wasn't for the people who just cared about seeing reality, it would be kind of pointless for you guys to be there. Which, I mean, maybe so. I mean, the temple would still exist. I guess maybe it'd be a little bit hollow without sort of I guess it's almost a mystical sense of true understanding of reality. Like without intention, and maybe it's misguided to say that one can truly see reality burying their own intentions. But I think that would be the only way if one was to really take a good crack at it. But it's also a way of losing sanity, because it is not a way that most other people are going to understand reality. And you're going to have to deal with the fact that, what you think you might see describing the contour of eternity, you might look at other people and suddenly think there's nothing there, that you're staring at a figment. And and that's why I appreciate my friend with schizophrenia, because he just has to learn to float in that space anyway, right? And there's something deeply worthwhile about learning to just float in an area of nothing. It's probably a more valuable skill than being purely intentional about the entire reality of your life, or checking off boxes for what you think your life should be. And so Phaedrus, who at the age of 15 had finished his freshman year of science, was at the age of 17 expelled from the university for failing grades. Immaturity and inattention to studies were given as official causes. There was nothing anyone could have done about it, either to prevent it or correct it. The university couldn't have kept him on without abandoning standards completely. In a stunned state, Phaedrus began a long series of lateral drifts that led him into a far orbit of the mind. But he eventually returned along a route we are now following, to the doors of the university itself. Okay, that's chapter 10. And I went on a few little diatribes there, mainly because might as well keep a thought in your head while you got it. Later on in the book, you keep a lot of stuff in your head, and then Well, it's why I'm a writer. I usually just keep things in my head and then write them down a couple sentences at a time. Writing is useful in that way. There's also useful that I can see why teachers like ask kids questions and stuff. Because, well, I read this thing by David Graeber that's incredibly hard to hold an individual thought in your head without like it holding an abstract thought in your head. You actually need conversation to hold an abstract thought in your head. Anyway, and this is about as abstract as it gets. But that is the problem laid out by Pirsig. Personally, I am more invested in the intentionality side of it, the how we understand reality. Well, and you know, Pirsig does change in Lila. He does do a whole chapter on Lila herself, the namesake of the book, from her perspective as she has a mental breakdown, which is very novelistic of him. You know, Pirsig takes a lot of the honest insights of novels, which is being in somebody's head, using characters as cogs for explaining intentions while also being able to look at them from a distance. But he never breaks us into a world outside of reality itself, or as we are trying to deduct from reality itself. So now I'm going to go back to page 58 and or 56. No, 34. Good God. And this is the very beginning of the book, where what Pirsig is actually offering is a solution to this problem he's just proposed about understanding reality. But it's a way of deconstructing reality that you might not consider inherently useful, or you might struggle what the point of understanding it is, as he explains to, you know, as the people in his book also struggle with it. So they're talking about ghosts. They're sitting around a campfire and they're talking about ghosts. And he says, my own opinion is that the intellect of modern man isn't that superior. IQs aren't that much different. Indians and medieval men were just as intelligent as we are, but the context in which they thought was completely different. Within that context of thought, ghosts and spirits are quite as real as atoms, particles, photons, and quants are to modern men. In that sense, I believe in ghosts. Modern man has his ghosts and spirits too, you know. What? Oh, the law of physics and logic, the number system, the principle of algebraic substitution. They're ghosts. We just believe in them so thoroughly they seem real. They seem real to me, John says. I go on. For example, it seems completely natural to presume that gravitation and the law of gravitation existed before Isaac Newton. It would sound nutty to think that until the 17th century there was no gravity. Of course. So when did this law start? Has it always existed? Is the notion that before the beginning of the earth, before the sun and the stars were formed, before the primal generation of anything, the law of gravity existed? Sure. Sitting there, having no mass of its own, no energy of its own, not in anyone's mind because there wasn't anyone, not in space because there was no space either, not anywhere, this law of gravity still existed. Now John seems not so sure. If that law of gravity existed, I say, I honestly don't know what a thing has to do to be non-existent. It seems to me that law of gravity has passed every test of non-existence there is. You cannot think of a single attribute of non-existence that law of gravity didn't have, or a single scientific attribute of existence it did have. And yet it is still common sense to believe that it existed. John says, I guess I'd have to think about it. Well, I predict that if you think about it long enough, you will find yourself going round and round and round until you finally reach only one possible rational, intelligent conclusion. The law of gravity and gravity itself did not exist before Isaac Newton. No other conclusion makes sense. And what that means, I say before he can interrupt, and what that means is that the law of gravity exists nowhere except in people's heads. It's a ghost. We are all of us very arrogant and conceited about running down other people's ghosts, but just as ignorant and barbaric and superstitious about our own. Why does everybody believe in the law of gravity then? Mass hypnosis, in a very orthodox form known as education. You mean the teacher is hypnotizing the kids into believing the law of gravity? Sure. That's absurd. You've heard of the importance of eye contact in the classroom? Every educationist emphasizes it. No educationist explains it. John shakes his head and pours me another drink. He puts his hand over his mouth and a mock aside says to Sylvia, You know, most of the time he seems like such a normal guy. I counter, that's the first normal thing I've said in weeks. The rest of the time I'm feigning 20th century lunacy just like you are, so as not to draw attention to myself. But I'll repeat it for you, I say. We believe the disembodied words of Sir Isaac Newton were sitting in the middle of nowhere, billions of years before he was born, and that magically he discovered these words. They were always there, even when they applied to nothing. Gradually the world came into being, and then they applied to it. In fact, those words themselves were what formed the world. That, John, is ridiculous. The problem, the contradiction the scientists are stuck with, is that of mind. Mind has no matter or energy, but they can't escape its predominance over everything they do. Logic exists in the mind. Numbers exist in the mind. I don't get upset when scientists say that ghosts exist in the mind. It's that only that gets me. Science is only in your mind, too. It's just that it doesn't make it bad, or ghosts either. Laws of nature are human inventions, like ghosts. Laws of logic, of mathematics are also human inventions, like ghosts. The whole blessed thing is a human invention, including the idea that it isn't a human invention. The world has no existence whatsoever outside the human imagination. It's all a ghost, and in antiquity was so recognized as a ghost. The whole blessed world we live in, it's run by ghosts. We see what we see because these ghosts show it to us. Ghosts of Moses and Christ and the Buddha and Plato and Descartes and Rousseau and Jefferson and Lincoln and on and on. Isaac Newton is a very good ghost, one of the best. Your common sense is nothing more than the voices of thousands and thousands of these ghosts from the past. Ghosts and more ghosts. Ghosts trying to find their place amongst the living. All right. Now, if that doesn't have your head spinning a little bit, then, well, you wouldn't have made it this far into the video. I don't even know who would have anyway. Now, the word ghost is also a manifestation of human language, right? So I think we have to take what Pirsig is giving us as what is the symbol of ghost. And it's what was laid out in chapter 10. That the farther you take something, the more, well, you know, I don't know. Now I'm just contradicting myself. I have all these things in my head, and then I don't know if this should actually feel like you're talking to anyone. It sort of feels like I'm just talking to myself, which does feel a little insane. When it's just in your head, it feels normal-ish. But considering everything as a ghost is actually a very rational way to help you decode reality. Okay? Now, that might sound a little weird. And it's often complicated. Like I saw a little video of a guy who was a magician, being like, I can't spend 2 minutes trying to explain to you how magic works. It, you know, it's not like that. It took me a decade to learn all the tricks of mentalism and because it's like a series of combined tricks that one learns to use over a lifetime. And I think the same is kind of true with reading. Like when I first read Pirsig, all I knew was that there was a lot more to it than I could really grasp. And coming back to it after a decade of reading other stuff, it all clicked for me. And I'm not sure this is going to be helpful at all for making it click for you. I think I'm just pointing out the things, the moments to me that were really indicative of what Pirsig was trying to say overall. It's not really about Zen. It's not. I mean, he studies Zen a little bit. He studies Zen Buddhism in India. But it was really kind of just a trick to sell books. Kind of the zeitgeist, as I said at the beginning. It's really, I mean, as he goes on, it's his deconstruction of this word quality, which I'm not really going to go into because I'm more interested in this reality piece of it, which I'm not going to recommend to you or anyone that you switch tactics and become the kind of person who is trying to see the mountains of eternity. I think you either are that person or you aren't. And I think I was that person. And those mountains are, in a lot of ways, figments of our imagination. Not that, I mean, I love figments of our imagination. It's like he's not using a word like ghost. He's not putting a moral substructure to it. He's not saying just because you think this way or are able to now look past the other things people put upon you, right? Like, instead of being, because that is part of the problem with education right now and in past times, is that hypnosis factor. That the teacher is going to try and lull you with facts into saying this is exactly how this thing is. That's not truly thinking. That's not truly using your intellect, right? Truly using your intellect is a little weird and crazy. And as Pirsig says in Lila, sanity is ridiculous because sanity is only sanity deemed by its own terms. Sanity has defined the terms of its own existence, and thusly, anything that's not doesn't fit those terms, sanity terms insane. But that's not what insanity really is. Insanity is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy towards the terms of sanity. And that to me is a very profound sentiment to approach to life. Like, there's a certain romanticization with writers and like madness and stuff. I was thinking about this the other day, and we'll see if I can retrieve the thought. But I don't think we should think of like creativity and madness as being conjoined or like or madness as a romantic notion. It's how I don't know if I can retrieve it. This is why you write things down. You have maybe I still do have a lot of hypotheses. I just don't trust myself anymore. So watch The Lord of the Rings again and drink too much beer. But maybe I'll return to this if there's interest. Maybe I'll do one on Lila, which is Pirsig's whole construction of moral philosophy. I don't think anyone bothered to understand it. And like the understanding of ghosts, maybe we don't need to. But for me, understanding reality in my own way, in that that contours of eternity way, which seemed to be the only way I could deduce it, was very important. And if I didn't come to terms with it, I probably would have destroyed myself or something to that nature. Not that I'm not actively in the process of destroying myself, but you know what I mean. Anyway, yeah. Zen is a very misunderstood book, and madness is also misunderstood. Okay. Bye, guys.